Hello and welcome to the video. It's that time of the year again. It's time for my annual look at the flight controller comparison. I've done one of these around this time of year for the past 2 years, so here we are again, beginning of summer, so we need to have another look. There's been a ton of changes in the hobby, and the amount of flight controllers that are available to us now as pilots has exploded. So whereas last year I tried to look at each of the individual flight controllers as they were around, unfortunately, it's getting a lot harder to do it that way because of the sheer number that's on there. Now, all of the flight controllers that are on these little cards here, which is how I tried to explain it last year, each of these has a series on the channel that you can go and watch that tells you how to set it up. But since then, we've done series for other flight controllers like the Betaflight F3. We've done for the Brain FPV RE1, which is an F4 based flight controller running Betaflight. We are about to start the Pixhawk 2.1 series. We're going to be taking a look at the Seriously Pro F4. There's a new F4 board coming from Holybro that we're about to check out. It is never ending, so it's becoming very difficult to try and look and think about flight controllers from the hardware point of view. There are obviously changes and differences, and we'll talk about those, but it's actually more useful now is rather than trying to figure out the hardware and what the best way to put the hardware in each of these kind of boxes that we tried to do last year. This Venn diagram in last year's video was trying to explain whether or not you wanted acro, GPS, or these kind of flight modes, which of these flight controllers were your best bet. This year we're going to do it a little bit differently. This year we're actually going to come at it from the software point of view, and that's because the majority of flight controllers that are out there will run several different versions of the flight controller software, and it's up to you as the pilot to choose which one you want. So the majority of the F3, F4 based flight controllers coming out now will be supported by Betaflight and CleanFlight and things like iNav as well. Things like the Pixhawks are also starting to be supported by iNav, so just because you buy something like an APM or a Pixhawk, you don't have to go with ArduPilot, you also have choice. There are differences with things like LibrePilot and D-Ronin as well. If you have a CC3D, then those are still excellent choices to put on there. And there is still support from Betaflight, CleanFlight and iNav for those older F1 based flight controllers, but the support is starting to get a little bit strained. At the bottom, we have our friends, the KISS flight control system. We'll talk a little bit about KISS. KISS for me is one of those which is a little bit unusual in that it's not an open source project as such, which all of these kind of others are. This is all software that doesn't cost you anything. KISS is one of those things that only runs on its own hardware really. But the reason I'm putting it on here is I'm a big fan of the KISS flight controller and the software. It's a really piece of cake to set up, and it flies beautifully out the box. My experience with it here is it's one of the flight controllers that needs the least amount of setting up to get it to fly really nicely. But there are a couple of others as well that we're not going to be covering as part of this series, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First one is MultiWii. We did a load of stuff with MultiWii back in the very early days. In fact, it's one of the things that kind of kick-started the entire channel, because the MultiWii stuff was actually really good, 8-bit technology, but the documentation was terrible. So we created a series, and that's been popular ever since. However, MultiWii is 8-bit. The MultiWii code itself has turned into Baseflight, which turned into CleanFlight, which turned into Betaflight, which turned into... So it's several generations out of date. The development on it has really slowed down on the original MultiWii version, and it's really come to the end of the road. Raceflight I'm not going to talk about. Raceflight is a version, or a completely rewritten version allegedly, of Betaflight, CleanFlight, so I'm not going to talk about that. And there's other ones as well. But for the moment, we're going to think about Betaflight, CleanFlight, iNav, ArduPilot, LibrePilot and D-Ronin and KISS. So let me talk about the differences between them. So Betaflight is really kind of the darling of the community at the moment. Most people will put Betaflight on their technology, and most of the ready-to-fly quads that you buy these days come with Betaflight as well. Betaflight is where the majority of the brand new exciting innovation is happening. So if you want the latest and greatest features, it's in here. It's very rapidly changing. There's been a lot of effort put into the project recently to try and maintain the code and to control things a little bit better, and we're all getting the benefit of that. So Betaflight has now, rather than being the beta test version of CleanFlight, has become the basis on which everything is starting to be built. Clean Flight, and we did a video on this a couple of months ago, is now taking Betaflight and doing to Betaflight what it originally did to Baseflight, which is the thing that came from MultiWii that started all of this off. Now, the whole thing with Clean Flight was that it was taking the Baseflight code and then using programming rigor to improve and stabilize the code so that it became as solid as it possibly can and easier to developers to work on. So we have two versions there that are very popular. Then we have iNav Flight. We have an entire series on iNav, originally forked from Clean Flight, but starting to take more and more from the Betaflight project now. And that has done an awful lot for pilots, particularly around GPS flight modes, and it also has an awful lot of work in there for fixed wing too. So those are three versions, and if you go onto the GitHub repository for any of these projects and have a look at the boards that are supported, you'll see the same names coming up time and time again. And a lot of the times, flight controllers are designed to be pin compatible with older versions or older targets for this software, so that rather than having to create a brand new target just for their board, they can kind of piggyback off something that's already there. So for example, something like the Seriously Pro F3 is a very common target that lots and lots of boards have copied, so that you can put the Seriously Pro F3 version of either Betaflight, Clean Flight or iNav Flight onto the board and it will work great. Then we have ArduPilot. ArduPilot and Mission Planner is all part of that APM Pixhawk 2.1 family, really separate from the other ones, originally developed and heavily supported by 3DR. Now it's kind of an open source project, but that's hoping to be supported by the sales of Pixhawk 2.1. Really mature. You wouldn't use this for something like racing, but if you want something like mission planning and super smooth flight, ArduPilot is fantastic. Supports wings, supports planes, supports quadcopters, multi-rotors, supports cars, boats, even submarines. Then we have LibrePilot and D-Ronin. This really came out of the OpenPilot project that sadly died a death about a year and a half ago. These are two slightly different versions that continue to support the CC3D and some of these older boards that are still knocking around. Great wizards for setup, and this stuff used to be what I would recommend for a pilot that was starting out very first build. The way that you had to set it up and the way it asked you all the questions was fantastic. And then at the bottom we have the KISS flight control technology. As I already said, KISS flight control technology is really good. I'm a big fan of it here. It only really runs on their own flight controllers. The interface is nice and easy to set up. The configuration and tuning is really straightforward. And actually the stuff that I've used has worked beautifully out the box and performed just as well as some of the copters that I've spent a good old week iteratively trying to tune it to get the best stuff out of it. So those are the headlines of the different flight controller softwares, the most common ones that you're going to come across. And hopefully you're starting to get an idea of which box you're going to fit in. So let me just have a look in a little bit more detail in the first four. So let's talk about Wideboard Support. Again, as we've talked about, Betaflight, Clean Flight and iNav support loads and loads of different targets and different flight controllers. So Omnibus, Betaflight F3, the Seriously Pro boards, there's loads and loads of different ones here. So if you have a flight controller that's reasonably modern, running an STM-F3 based CPU, you're probably going to be able to run one, two or even all of these on your flight controller. They're all fantastic for acrobatic because a lot of the code that they're using to fly is very similar. When you start to look at things like using GPS modes, then you find that Betaflight and Clean Flight start to struggle a little bit. And if you talk about lots of redundancy and those kind of pieces, then all of them start to run out of speed apart from ArduPilot. Again, on the right hand side, you can see that there is support in Betaflight and Clean Flight for fixed wings. It hasn't been a priority. It is there, but it's not something that's really been innovated or actively worked on over the last few months. Whereas iNav, if you look at that, it's actually really good for fixed wing as well as multi-rotors, and they've even done things like introduce special PIF loops rather than PID loops for fixed wing craft. And PIF loops is actually what ArduPilot uses to control planes. So if you look at ArduPilot, it doesn't have wideboard support. It'll only really run on APM Pixhawk PX4 style flight controllers. It isn't fantastic for acro. I'd never use an Ardu Pilot system for racing, flips and rolls and hang time and those kind of things. That kind of innovation and fun stuff is happening up at Betaflight, CleanFlight, and eventually down to iNav. It is amazing for GPS, gives the best GPS experience in my humble opinion. You can upload missions to it and you can do everything you want to do. It's been doing GPS for years and years and years, which is forever in this hobby, and it's very, very stable. And it also supports lots of redundancy. So with Ardu Pilot, it knows how to handle multiple power supplies, multiple sensors, multiple GPS resources, has telemetry radio support, there's loads of stuff. So that is more useful for those kind of pilots. So let's talk a little bit then about the boards that you use with each of them. So we'll talk first of all about the Betaflight, CleanFlight and iNav pieces. I would say that Betaflight and CleanFlight and iNav, if you want the creme de la creme and something that's going to be supported, the latest features in 12-18 months from now, you're probably looking at an F4 or even one of the new F7 based flight controllers. An F3 based flight controller will run all of these without any problem at all, but as time goes on, more and more features and more sophistication is being added into all of this software, which will require additional horsepower and additional features too. So an F3 based board today is absolutely fantastic. That's the entry level for any of these systems. When I talked about this last year, I was still talking about some of the old F1 based flight controllers like the NASI32 and some of the older bits and pieces as well. I now wouldn't recommend that you use any F1 based flight controller. The F1 boards are being supported by the majority of the projects that are around, but to do it they're having to drop code so that you can't turn on all the things in these F1 based flight controllers that you can if you're running F3 or F4 or F7. F1 is still capable of doing basic stabilization, but I think it's only a matter of time before it gets almost too hard for the continued support for those F1 systems. So if you have some of those F1 boards flying around, it's only $20-30 now for a F3 based flight controller that will do the job. Personally, I'd be looking at replacing a few of them. In fact, one of my last CC3D quadcopters is about to get upgraded in a series that I'll be starting in a couple of weeks. Then we move down to Ardu Pilot. A couple of choices for the Ardu Pilot technology here. Pixhawk 2.1 is the creme de la creme. It should be. It's one of those things that is very new. It's very cutting edge in terms of its technology, how it works, the internal dampening. It has 3 IMU units, 2 barometers. It'll support multiple it's the creme de la creme. But there are still clones available of the Pixhawk, and the Pixhawk will do the majority of the basic stuff that the Pixhawk 2.1 will do, and will also do all of that fantastic mission planning too. So if you don't want to spend all the money for a Pixhawk 2.1 and you're happy using a clone, then Pixhawk is still a fantastic option, 32-bit, and it works great. And again, last year I talked about the APM still being a great little platform. Again, we're starting to see that older 8-bit technology that Mission Planner and Ardu Pilot supported, we're starting to see the cracks appearing there in terms of support. So I think it's only a matter of time before APM starts to really struggle. The official support for APM finished about a year and a half ago with Arducopter 3.2.1, I think was the last version. It's moved on significantly since then, but things like the interfaces and Mission Planner are starting to make it harder to configure that as they focus on the support for the Pixhawk and the Pixhawk 2.1. Again, I've actually removed all the APM flight controllers from all of the models that I have here now. And the only thing I may do with them is that they can be used for antenna trackers, so that might be a project for over the summer. So what do you need to think about when you're choosing a flight controller for the software? Because hopefully going through that, you've got an idea which is the software that fits what you're trying to build and how you want to fly. I personally would always try and choose a flight controller with F3 or F4 better CPUs. We've already talked about that. It'll give you a little bit more headroom. Do think about whether or not you want integrated on-screen displays. We've looked at things like the omnibus board that we used in the iNav project. The Omnibus boards available in several different versions. There's tons of them out there now, like the Betaflight F3, that all have integrated on-screen displays now. Those integrated on-screen displays are configurable through the graphical user interface and are a piece of cake to set up. So if you want to do FPV and you want to be able to display things like the battery power consumption and those bits and bobs as well, then consider getting one with an on-screen display integrated into the flight controller. They're actually not that much more expensive now than ones without. Other thing to consider is if you want an integrated power distribution board. Again, this used to be a separate part of the system. Now more and more flight controllers are starting to come with it. So we have the new boards from Holybro, we have the Betaflight F3 flight controller that we looked at recently. Lots and lots of them now are starting to have that power distribution board built in, so that all you have to do is connect your ESCs into the corner, connect your camera and your video transmitter and a receiver, and you've made all the connections that you want. It makes wiring very, very straightforward, but the more technology that you put in a flight controller, the more chance you have of something going wrong. And rather than replacing a discrete separate board, like if a Minim OSD broke, then you just replace it with a new one. If something goes pop on one of these other boards, then you've destroyed the entire board. But it does mean that you can make some really small compact models with what used to be 4 or 5 separate circuit boards all in one little unit. Do consider the size. Most of these flight controllers now are the same size. Obviously things like the Pixhawk and the Pixhawk 2.1 are significantly bigger. Some of the all-in-one boards are fractionally larger than a standard flight controller because they have pins and things out the side to accommodate the connections for the ESCs. But there are mini versions as well. So if you're building a kind of a sub 160mm frame, you kind of got a 20mm versions of the boards available that are great if you are tight on space. Do think about whether or not you want more than 4 outputs for motors ESCs. A lot of these ones that have all integrated outputs only have the outputs for those 4 connections for a quadcopter. So something like the Betaflight F3 that we were looking at was very much in that vein. If you're going to use a flight controller for something like a flying wing, that's probably not going to be an issue for you. If you're going to use it for something like a conventional airplane, then you might want additional connections as well, because you're going to need one for your ESC and motor, one for your elevator, one for your rudder, one for your ailerons minimum, but there's a very good chance you're going to have at least one more aileron connection, maybe another connection as well for gear. There's loads of different things, so have a think about how many connections that you want. Some of these boards that are all-in-ones are really only designed for quads. Do look at the feedback on how easy everything is to connect and set up, because these boards are not only coming out quite quickly, but some of them are also being revised quite quickly as well. Do look at the forums, do look at what people are saying. You'll always have fanboys and detractors for every system out there, but reading through the stuff in the forum will give you a general tone of how the thing performs. As we move into the latest generation of flight controllers, we're all moving back into mounting everything on anti-vibration mounts, where originally when we came from multi-wii we moved away from that. We're all moving back to it now because the frequencies and the loop times and the motors and props that we're using were starting to get back into that territory. So have a think about all of that when you're thinking about a flight controller that you want to buy. Last comment I'll make is do think about GPS flight modes. We've done that iNav series, go and have a look at that. You do need to think a little bit if you're going to use something like an F3 base board for iNav flight for GPS flight modes on a wing or a multicopter. You have to be a little bit careful because ideally you want a different magnetometer on board than you're going to mount externally. We cover that in the iNav series, but there are some better options than others, and we talk about that in that iNav series that I'll link to in the bottom. So to round up everything, let me give you the answers to the questions that I get on a regular basis. And here is what I'd use for each of these use cases with all of that stuff said before in mind. For easy multi-rotor setup and great flying out the box, I'd now recommend a KISS system. I know it's kind of almost proprietary, I guess you could call it, but it's dead easy to set up. It works really well, it flies beautifully, and the support from those guys is fantastic. If you're looking for everyday multi-rotor flying, I would look at an F3 based flight controller on running either Betaflight or CleanFlight. I really personally like the Brain FPV RE1. That is an F4 based flight controller. The thing you need to remember about that is it doesn't run a vanilla Betaflight version. It runs their own version of it because it has that vector based on screen display, but I've got a couple of the Brain RE1s and I really like them. Multi-rotor racing, then you're really looking F3 or F4 base flight controller with Betaflight. For basic multi-rotor and fixed-wing GPS flying these days, I would say go for iNav Flight and have a look a F3 or F4 based flight controller. Again, we cover all of that in the series, but for a $20 flight controller and a $20 GPS, you can have your multi-rotor or your fixed-wing model do some pretty funky stuff. For fixed-wing models, multi-rotors, even boats, cars, even subs, then have a look at the Ardu Pilot with a Pixhawk. I wouldn't consider APM anymore. I think APMs is starting to run out of steam. Look at a Pixhawk. There are a load of clones available. You can get all the things that you need, the power module, the GPS and everything in one little bundle, usually from China, and stick one of the Ardu Pilot. So either Ardu Copter, Ardu Plane, Ardu Rover, one of those things on it, and you'll be able to have a fantastic system. Again, not perfect for racing and acro flying, but amazing for super stable flight, and also gives you mission planning capabilities as well as things like really good fail-safes and return to home options. And then the last one here for the ultimate fixed-wing multi-rotors, boat, cars, subs, mission planning and excellent GPS modes, I'd go with the Ardu Pilot and Pixhawk 2.1, and that Pixhawk 2.1, again, it's a real price premium right now. There's no clones around, and if you cast your mind back to what it was like when the first Pixhawks and APMs first came out, they were blooming expensive as well, and that's why there is their price difference. So hopefully that helps those of you thinking about flight controllers. I would recommend these days thinking about what you want to do with the model, how you want to fly it, and then think about the software that you're going to use and let the software choice inform you of the flight controller. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video, and particularly for watching right to the very end. We try and release a video on Tuesday and Friday, and sometimes we'll release one or two extra ones in a week as well. All of the videos on the channel are organised into easy to use playlists, so do have a look in there, because if you're interested in a subject, we organise all the videos on that subject so you can find them easily all together in one place. If you like what we're doing, then please like and subscribe and tell others about the channel so they can come and join as well. We're available in all of the usual social media places, particularly in places like Instagram, Twitter, and we also share all of our 3D designs on Thingiverse.